What would you do if you discovered that behind one of the most sacred places in the world, there are secrets so dark that they could shake even the deepest beliefs? Today, you will hear a story that goes beyond the boundaries of faith and plunges into an abyss of hidden mysteries. It's not a legend, nor a tale to scare children. It's the account of someone who lived through the horrors hidden in the depths of the Vatican. Welcome to another night where mysteries never sleep. I am Midnight, and this is 7 Nights. Before diving into this plot filled with chilling revelations, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more stories like this to you. Get ready to uncover secrets that defy reason and, above all, to question, is everything sacred truly pure? Let's begin. Dark revelation. Have you ever wondered what really lies beneath the imposing domes of the Vatican? Let me ask you something. When you look at that massive place full of history, do you think there's something more there beyond prayers? Well, today's story will make you think twice. Many imagine its walls hold nothing but sanctity and faith, but few know about the shadows that linger there. This is not a story of glory or redemption. My name, if it matters at all, can be the priest, but my title has long ceased to mean anything. I'm here to share one of the many accounts I've lived through, not to exalt my bravery or demonstrate piety, but to warn you. What I'm about to reveal is just a fraction of a greater horror that many refuse to believe. Over the years, the Vatican has stood as a symbol of purity and spiritual authority. However, those who know its most hidden corridors are aware that the place holds secrets as ancient as they are disturbing. Behind its immaculate facade lies a network of mysteries that challenge even the strongest convictions. I have lived to witness things that could not be recounted in a sermon or recorded in a history book. Things that have scarred my soul in ways words cannot describe. What brings me here is the burden I carry. This is not a confession, nor a quest for forgiveness. The Vatican is not merely a space of faith. It is a ground where invisible battles are fought. Not between saints and demons, but between what is permissible and what should never be done. I was a witness and, at times, an executor of actions that should never have occurred. But silence has its limits, and I have reached mine. To many, my story will sound absurd, like a tale made up to frighten. To others, it might seem like an unfair accusation. To me, it's simply the truth. The truth I lived, breathed, and that still haunts me in the quietest moments. I am not here seeking judgment, but to offer you a window into something you probably never wanted to know. This story, however, does not begin in darkness. Like many tragedies, it began with a bright light, with unshakable dreams and faith. When I arrived at the Vatican, I believed I was fulfilling my destiny. I was blinded by the grandeur and the promise of serving something greater. Little did I know that this promise would be the beginning of my greatest torment. So, I invite you to accompany me. This is a tale of destroyed faith, of secrets, and of loyalty that cost me my soul. The truth of what happened in the depths of the Vatican is something I still struggle to admit. But this is just a piece. Perhaps one day, the entire puzzle will be revealed. Arrival at the Vatican and initial belief. My arrival at the Vatican in 1961 was marked by a mix of wonder and purpose. Since childhood, I believed I was destined for something greater, and being chosen to continue my training there seemed to confirm this calling. As I passed through the imposing gates, I felt as if I had been led straight into the heart of faith. The first days were a succession of discoveries that nourished my devotion. I walked through corridors filled with history, where every painting and sculpture seemed to carry the weight of centuries of spirituality. The grandeur of the place was almost overwhelming, but I saw it as a reflection of the greatness of the mission I had undertaken. However, the atmosphere of solemnity began to reveal nuances I hadn't anticipated. There were silent rules, measured gestures, and a rigidity that seemed to extend to every aspect of life there. Questions were not encouraged, and evasive answers became the norm. Even so, my initial fervor blinded me to any unease. I believed that by following the rules and showing obedience, I would eventually understand everything in due time. I thought I was ready to face any challenge in the name of faith. But the truth was, I was only beginning to scratch the surface of what really happened within those walls. First impressions of the Vatican. During the first months, my routine at the Vatican was humble and focused on simple tasks. Imagine starting a new job and thinking, okay, I'll do my best here. Now multiply that by 1,000, with the pressure of being in a place where every detail seems to carry immense weight. I would wake up before dawn to organize liturgical objects for the masses and ensure that everything was in perfect order. To me, these tasks were more than work, they were acts of devotion. Every candle I lit, every chalice I prepared, was a way of honoring the greatness of the Church and my own faith. However, something began to shift in my perception. As I dedicated myself to each task, I noticed the emotional distance of my superiors. There were no smiles or words of encouragement. The atmosphere was cold, almost oppressive. I attributed this to the seriousness of the work. After all, we were dealing with matters of faith and salvation. But over time, I began to feel that this coldness concealed something deeper. My faith was still strong, and I didn't want to question the Church's authority. But behind my superiors' severe gazes, there was something that seemed like a warning. I saw seminarians entering halls and never coming out, or being abruptly transferred without explanations. I didn't know what it meant, but a sense of unease began to grow inside me. The architecture of the Vatican, once fascinating, started to feel intimidating. Certain corridors were dark, too silent, as if isolated from the rest of the world. Some doors had locks that seemed ancient, reinforcing the feeling that they hid something important. My curiosity began to clash with the silence imposed as the norm. But I knew that questioning could put me in danger, and I wasn't willing to risk my position so soon. The strangest part was how my superiors treated me. Always serious, they never gave complete explanations about what they expected of me beyond my daily tasks. I admired them, but I also feared them. I knew that any sign of insubordination could mean the end of my training there. So, I continued to remain silent, even as doubts began to consume me. At the time, I still saw all this as part of a test. I thought that the coldness and silence were a way of proving my faith. I didn't imagine they were merely preparing the ground for something much greater and darker. I thought I was gaining spiritual strength, but in reality, I was being shaped for a role I never chose to play. Discovery of rigidity and oppression. As the weeks passed, it became evident that the Vatican was governed by an order as inflexible as the stones of its walls. Obedience was more than a virtue, it was an absolute requirement. Any deviation, no matter how small, was met with a coldness that bordered on cruelty. I witnessed this for the first time when a seminarian, exhausted by the grueling routine, hesitated in following instructions during a ceremony. He was reprimanded with disproportionate severity, as if a single mistake could compromise everything. There was no room for human error. This experience stayed with me, but at the time, I justified it as part of the rigorous training necessary for the greatness of the mission. Oppression wasn't only visible in reproachful looks or harsh words. It was ingrained in the very silence of the place. Everyone walked as if on eggshells, afraid to say too much or ask something inconvenient. Even moments of prayer seemed distant and mechanical, more of a duty than a genuine connection with the divine. There were corridors in the Vatican that seemed deliberately forgotten. Some were so deserted that the sound of my own footsteps made me hesitate. Certain doors remained closed, protected by ancient locks that seemed more symbolic than functional. When I asked a colleague about these places, he simply shook his head, murmuring that it was better not to ask questions. At that moment, I still clung to the belief that it was all part of a greater plan, something I might not yet be ready to understand. But deep down, a doubt began to emerge, a nagging feeling that the weight of those rules wasn't just disciplinary but suffocating. The role of Cardinal Benedetto Mancini, it was in this atmosphere of silence and rigidity that I met Cardinal Benedetto Mancini. He was a figure who inspired respect and fear in equal measure. Tall, with impeccable posture, he had a gaze so penetrating it seemed to see into the soul of anyone daring to meet his eyes. His words were few, but each carried an indescribable weight. When he spoke, everyone listened, and when he looked, no one dared to look away. Mancini was not just a leader, he was a force. My first direct encounter with him occurred after a morning mass. He approached me with firm steps, but did not look directly into my eyes. He merely said, in a calm voice, that he would need my help with some tasks. There was no room for refusal, nor did it seem necessary. To me, that invitation was an honor, an opportunity to serve someone who represented the pinnacle of faith and authority. The tasks began simply. I reviewed documents, transcribed meeting reports, and organized ancient books. Mancini rarely spoke to me during these activities. He merely observed, as if he were evaluating me. Over time, I noticed that these tasks had something in common. They all seemed to involve sensitive information, something not openly shared. Gradually, my admiration for him began to mingle with a sense of unease. One night, after a long day of work, Mancini asked me to stay for a prayer in his office. At first, it seemed like a routine activity, but I soon realized there was something different. He prayed in a low voice, almost whispering words I couldn't understand. The silence in the room was so dense it seemed to take on a life of its own, as if something invisible were watching us. I left that room with the feeling that there was more to those prayers than I could comprehend. As time went on, Mancini began to involve me in increasingly unusual tasks. He asked me to organize objects I had never seen before: crucifixes with strange symbols, scrolls in unknown languages, and chalices decorated with inscriptions that seemed centuries old. Though he never explained the purpose of these items, it was evident that they held special meaning. I wanted to ask, but I knew I shouldn't. Mancini's behavior towards me was a mix of authority and manipulation. He was never aggressive, but his presence was enough to make me obey without question. With each new task, I felt I was being tested, as if he wanted to see how far I was willing to go. Little did I know that these tests were merely the prelude to something much greater and far darker. The descent into the catacombs, it was on a cold night that Mancini asked me to accompany him to a place I had never visited. Now think about it. You're going about your tasks, and suddenly you're summoned to a place no one talks about. Chills down your spine. Exactly, my friend. Without a word, he led me through corridors that seemed darker and quieter than usual. I followed him without hesitation, though something inside me screamed to stop. After a few minutes of walking, we arrived at an aged iron door with a heavy lock that looked centuries old. Mancini pulled a large key from his tunic and inserted it into the lock. The sound of metal creaking echoed through the corridors, creating an even more somber atmosphere. When the door opened, it revealed a narrow staircase descending into the depths. The air there was different, cold and damp, carrying the scent of ancient stone and something I couldn't identify. He said nothing, merely began descending, and I followed, not knowing what awaited me. The stairs seemed endless, each step taking me further from the world I knew. When we finally reached the bottom, we faced a long corridor lit only by torches. The flickering flames cast shadows that danced on the stone walls, creating shapes that seemed to come alive. The silence there was almost unbearable, not the comforting kind, but the kind that weighs on your shoulders and presses on your chest. As we walked down the corridor, I began to notice heavy wooden doors on the sides. Each had a small opening that looked into the cells. I didn't need to look inside to feel the presence of something, or someone. There was a heavy, almost suffocating energy emanating from those spaces. As we passed, I heard whispers coming from the shadows, words I couldn't understand but that carried palpable anguish. Mancini finally stopped in front of one of these doors and, without saying anything, looked at me. With a nod, he indicated that I should approach. My breathing was quick, but I obeyed. Looking through the small opening, I saw only darkness until a face suddenly appeared, filling the entire space. It was an expression of pure despair, with eyes pleading for help. I stepped back, startled, but Mancini remained still, as if this were perfectly normal. At that moment, I realized there was something profoundly wrong there. The catacombs were not just a place of isolation or prayer. They were an abyss, a space where light did not penetrate, both literally and spiritually. And I, by following Mancini there, was becoming part of that world. The trials conducted by Cardinal Mancini after that first visit to the catacombs, something within me changed. I knew that place was more than a simple extension of the Vatican, but I didn't fully understand what it represented. Mancini, however, seemed increasingly comfortable taking me there. Soon, these visits became part of my routine, and with each descent, I was introduced to something new, something that tested my faith and sanity. Mancini called what we did trials. At first, I thought they were exorcism rituals, an extension of the work I had been taught in seminary, but I soon realized they were very different. There were no prayers of deliverance or pleas for mercy. Everything there seemed calculated to impose suffering. Mancini used strange objects, crosses with inscriptions I didn't recognize, relics I had never seen mentioned in religious texts, and chants in languages completely unfamiliar to me. The trials were not just rituals, they were experiments. Mancini observed the prisoners like a scientist examining a specimen. He seemed interested in measuring how far human resilience could go, both physically and spiritually. I watched in silence, unable to look away but wishing it would all end. The cardinal instructed me not to speak, only to observe, as if preparing me for something greater, something he believed I needed to learn. Over time, I began to notice patterns. The prisoners, despite their deplorable conditions, didn't seem to be simple criminals or demon-possessed individuals, as Mancini suggested. Some begged for forgiveness, others murmured that they were innocent. The idea that they were there simply for defying the church began to form in my mind, but I lacked the courage to ask or confront the cardinal. His cold, calculated gaze kept me silent. Each session seemed to take a piece of me. It wasn't just the screams and murmurs that disturbed me, but what they represented. I was witnessing the destruction of souls, and it left me conflicted. My faith taught me that the church should protect the weak, yet there we were, condemning those who were already broken. Even so, I continued. The obedience instilled in me from the beginning still held an overwhelming sway over me. During one of these sessions, I noticed something even more disturbing. Mancini seemed to feed off the suffering he caused. His eyes gleamed with an intensity bordering on fanaticism. He was not just a man of faith, he was an executor of something much darker. And deep down, I knew I was becoming a part of it all. Growth of doubt as weeks went by, doubt began to consume me. Each descent into the catacombs left me more restless, further away from the faith that once guided me. Mancini's words, which had previously sounded like absolute truths, now seemed laden with intentions I could not comprehend. I began to question, what were these proofs really? And why did the church allow something so cruel to take place in its depths? These doubts ate away at me, but I couldn't voice them. Mancini was a figure of absolute authority, and any sign of weakness or questioning could be fatal. I saw in his eyes the vigilance of someone always ready to crush any trace of insubordination. My silence, however, came at a high cost. Each time I returned to the catacombs, I felt as though I left a piece of my soul behind. The note I received from Juliana, a nurse working at the Vatican, only intensified my torment. She wrote that many of the prisoners in the catacombs were not possessed or evil but heretics, dissidents who had questioned the church's doctrines. As I read those words, my heart sank. I had always believed the Vatican was the bastion of divine justice, but now it was beginning to seem like a machine of repression and suffering. I began to see the prisoners' faces differently. They were no longer just anonymous figures in the shadows. They were people with stories, with lives that had been destroyed. The despair in their eyes haunted me, even as I tried to convince myself that it was all necessary, that it all served a greater purpose. But these justifications felt increasingly hollow. The worst part was knowing I was complicit. My silence, my presence there, made me part of that cycle of cruelty. I wanted to believe I had no choice, but the truth was that I was trapped, not by the Vatican's walls, but by the invisible chains of obedience and fear. And those chains were stronger than any locked door. With each passing day, I felt I was drifting further away from who I was, from who I wanted to be. The faith that had once been my fortress now felt like a prison. I knew I needed to do something, but Mancini's influence was like a shadow that never left me. I was lost, torn between what I believed and what I was living. Juliana entered my life like a small light amidst the darkness. There's always that one person who appears out of nowhere to remind you that there's still a fight to be fought. Amid so much silence, Juliana was almost a miracle. She was discreet, always in the background, but her eyes seemed to carry more than simple curiosity. It was as if she could see what I was going through, even without me saying a word. Her frequent appearances during ceremonies and in the corridors began to intrigue me until the day she finally approached me. It was on a silent night, after yet another descent into the catacombs. I was walking alone through the corridors when I saw her standing there, waiting for me. Without saying a word, she handed me a small folded note and left before I could ask what it was. When I finally read what was written, my world began to crumble. She knew about the catacombs, about the prisoners, and she said that many of them were not enemies of the faith but victims of the system. Those words hit me like a blow. I had already suspected, but seeing someone else confirm my doubts was devastating. At the same time, it was comforting to know I wasn't alone, that there was someone else who saw the Vatican for what it really was. But it also meant that Juliana was at as much risk as I was, perhaps even more, for daring to speak about it. Juliana began to appear more often, always subtly. Our encounters were never long, but she managed to say a lot in few words. She spoke of how the Vatican hid its mistakes, of how power and fear were used to control not only the faithful, but also those who worked within its walls. She warned me to be careful, not to show my doubts in front of Mancini. Juliana's presence was both a relief and a burden. Knowing that someone else shared my view gave me strength, but it also made me realize how vulnerable we both were. Each time I saw her, I feared it might be the last. The Vatican did not forgive betrayals, and she knew too much. I wondered how she had managed to survive so long there, carrying that knowledge. Juliana became a symbol for me, a reminder that I still had choices, however limited. But what to do with those choices? I could try to help her, attempt to escape, or simply remain silent, accepting my role in that cycle of destruction. The doubt consumed me, and every decision seemed to carry a greater risk than the other. Internal conflict after my conversations with Juliana, something inside me began to change. The silence I had once carried as a reflection of obedience now felt like a prison. Each passing day, her words echoed in my mind, forcing me to confront reality. I had sworn loyalty to the Church, but deep down, I knew I was betraying the principles that had led me to the Vatican. My faith was being consumed, and with it, my very identity. Each visit to the catacombs became harder to bear. The screams and whispers that had once frightened me now haunted me even when I was far away. I began to have nightmares, dreams where the prisoners' faces stared at me, questioning my role in their suffering. Mancini seemed to notice my unease, though he said nothing. His stares, more intense with each passing day, made me feel as though he was waiting for a mistake, for a moment of weakness to justify some action against me. I knew I had to make a decision, but all the options seemed terrible. Staying meant continuing as a part of a system I could no longer accept. But leaving or even attempting to question could mean my ruin. The Vatican was not a place where people simply disappeared, but stories of sudden transfers and prolonged silences circulated among the seminarians. What if I were the next victim? Even so, there were moments when I felt I had to do something. I remembered Juliana's words and the despair in the prisoner's eyes. These images haunted me, pushing me beyond the limits of my tolerance. But how could I act without exposing myself for Juliana? I knew Mancini had eyes and ears everywhere. Nothing escaped his vigilance, and that made any attempt at rebellion practically impossible. My body began reacting to the emotional weight I was carrying. Insomnia, constant fatigue, a sense of emptiness that could not be filled. My reflection in mirrors no longer seemed the same. I saw a broken man, someone who had lost the essence that once guided him. Faith, once my greatest comfort, now felt like a burden, something I carried only because I was unable to let it go. With each step I took inside the Vatican, it felt as though I was walking toward an abyss. But it wasn't just the Vatican that held me captive. It was what it had done to me. The feeling that I had lost everything, my faith, my innocence, my humanity, was crushing. And yet, even amid this torment, I knew something needed to be done. The question was how, and at what cost? The watchful eyes of Cardinal Mancini. Mancini was a man who never needed to raise his voice to impose authority. His presence was enough. Every word he spoke seemed carefully chosen, as if he knew exactly how to manipulate those around him. Over time, I began to notice that his gaze on me had become more frequent, more attentive. It was as if he knew of the doubts growing inside me, even though I had never voiced them. Every task he gave me seemed to be a test. He placed me in situations that forced me to deal with the suffering of prisoners up close, as if he wanted to measure my resilience. On one occasion, he asked me to carry one of the relics to a specific cell. When I entered, I saw a man kneeling against the stone wall, murmuring something I couldn't understand. Mancini watched me from the corridor, waiting to see how I would react. These moments were suffocating. I felt as if I was being molded, like a piece of clay, into something I did not want to become. Mancini was a master at finding people's weaknesses and using them to his advantage. He never spoke directly about my inner conflicts, but his actions showed that he knew. At times, his presence was so oppressive that I felt like running away, but what lay beyond the Vatican walls? There was no escape. Worse than what Mancini did was what he didn't do. His prolonged silences, his pauses before responding, everything seemed calculated to keep me in suspense. Each day, he subtly increased the pressure, as if he knew exactly how far he could push me before I broke. And I, unable to resist, simply followed his orders, accumulating more guilt with every step. I began to suspect that he was preparing me for something greater. The trials, the constant visits to the catacombs, the strange objects he made me handle, all seemed part of a larger plan I couldn't fully see. Mancini was a meticulous man, and nothing he did was accidental. But what did he expect from me? What did he see in me that made him invest so much time and energy? His presence in my life was suffocating yet inescapable. Mancini was like a shadow that followed me, even when I was alone. His influence permeated every aspect of my routine, and I knew that any attempt to escape or confront him would be futile. He was the master of this game, and I was merely a pawn on the board. Reflection and loss of faith. The nights in the Vatican became long and empty. Have you ever felt that emptiness that no matter what you do, won't go away? Here, it becomes a constant companion. I tried to pray, but the words seemed to escape before reaching my lips. The crucifix in my room, once a symbol of comfort, now served as a bitter reminder of the faith that seemed to be disintegrating within me. I began to question everything. The Vatican, which I once saw as the heart of sanctity, now seemed like a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. I wondered how a place that should be a refuge of purity could harbor so much pain and mystery. Even more disturbing was the thought that I was involved in it all, even if only as a silent spectator. The loss of my faith didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process, like a rope unraveling fiber by fiber. First, I stopped believing in the sanctity of the men who led the church. Then, I began to doubt the institution itself. Finally, I found myself questioning the existence of God. If he truly existed, how could he allow so much suffering to be committed in his name? I had become a shadow of the young man who once arrived at the Vatican full of hope. I no longer knew who I was or what I believed in. But even amid despair, a small part of me still yearned for redemption. I didn't know how or where to find it, but I knew I had to try before the darkness consumed me completely. The interaction with Juliana as a decisive impulse. Juliana's presence became a constant in my mind. Her words, so simple, carried a weight that no sermon or teaching had ever provided. She was a voice of reason amid the chaos. Each time I thought of giving up, I remembered her gaze, filled with determination and compassion. Even knowing the risks we faced, she continued to encourage me not to surrender entirely to the darkness. Our conversations were always brief, but full of meaning. She spoke to me about the prisoners, about how many had been condemned simply for challenging the system. Some of the stories she told still echo in my mind. A priest who questioned dogmas, a nun who dared to expose corruption, a young seminarian who refused to participate in obscure rituals. All of them, Juliana said, were considered enemies of the church and sent to oblivion in the catacombs. Juliana seemed to know more than she should, but never revealed how she had obtained this information. Perhaps she had access to records, or maybe her position as a nurse put her in contact with people at vulnerable moments, allowing them to confide in her. What was clear, however, was that she understood the Vatican system better than I did and used this knowledge to guide me. Still, I could sense the weight she carried. At times, her voice trembled, as if fear was slowly consuming her. It was Juliana who planted the idea that I could do something, even if small, to interrupt the cycle of suffering. She suggested that I begin documenting everything I saw and heard in the catacombs. "If you can't act now, at least prepare for the day when the truth can be revealed," she whispered to me. That stayed with me like a command I couldn't ignore. With each encounter, my determination grew, but so did my fear. Juliana wasn't just risking her position in the Vatican, she was risking her life. I knew that if Mancini or any other superior discovered what she was doing, her fate would be the same as those imprisoned in the catacombs. And this only increased my guilt. As much as I wanted to act, I felt powerless in the face of the situation's magnitude. Still, Juliana was proof that courage still existed. Her strength inspired me to carry on, even when despair seemed the only answer. She had become my only ally, a light in the darkness that seemed to consume me. I knew I couldn't fail her, but at the same time, I feared that my inertia would destroy us both. The invisible prison. In the end, I understood that the Vatican wasn't just a physical place. It was an idea, an invisible prison that kept us captive to our own fears and guilt. Those imposing walls concealed horrors few would dare to imagine. But for me, the worst wasn't what was hidden in the catacombs. It was what it was doing to me. Each descent, each scream, each look from Mancini stole a piece of my humanity. I knew that as long as I remained there, I would never find peace. Yet leaving also seemed impossible. Mancini's influence was like a constant shadow, a presence that wouldn't even allow me to think of escape. The church had molded me to obey, to accept, and breaking those chains was harder than I could have imagined. I wasn't just a prisoner of the catacombs, I was a prisoner of myself. Even so, I began documenting my experiences as Juliana had suggested. Every word written was a silent scream, an attempt to preserve the truth no one wanted to hear. I knew these notes could condemn me, but I also knew that without them, I would be betraying not only the prisoners but also the small part of me that still believed in justice. The Vatican continued with its routines, its masses, its prayers. To the outside world, it was a bastion of faith and hope. but I knew what lay beneath the surface. Every corridor, every room, every ritual was a mask for something much darker. And as long as I remained there, I was part of this theater, an unwilling participant in a system that destroyed everything it touched. My faith, once unshakable, was now just a shadow of what it had been. I still believed in God, but I no longer knew if I could trust the church that claimed to represent him. The words that once gave me comfort now seemed empty, and the silence of the Vatican, once reverent, now felt oppressive. I didn't know how, but I knew I needed to find a way out before it was too late. This story is just one piece of the puzzle. I can't reveal everything, not yet. The things I've seen and experienced in the Vatican are not just secrets. They're scars I will carry forever. Perhaps one day, I'll be able to tell the rest. For now, all I can do is warn you. Not everything that seems sacred is pure, and not everything that seems just as divine. This story is just one piece, and one day, perhaps we'll see the entire puzzle. Not everything that seems sacred is pure, and not everything that seems just as divine. If this story has made you think as well, subscribe and like the video. It helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share. After all, more voices mean more discoveries. Good night, and remember, the mysteries never sleep. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this mystery captivated you. But I bet you haven't seen everything yet. Click on the next videos now to continue your journey into the unknown. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe so you don't miss the next secrets I'm about to reveal. But be careful, once you step inside, there's no turning back.